I hope everyone had an enjoyable August break. I'm Lynn Markey, and I'm here on behalf of the Coalition for Life Sciences, and we're happy to sponsor the Congressional Biomedical Research Caucus briefings. Our CBRC chairs are Congressman Rush Holt from New Jersey, Mike Castle from Delaware, I'm on the spot, Jackie Spear from California, who's our newest member, and also Brian Bilbray from California. Without them, these events couldn't take place, so we're very grateful for their action and support of the caucus. Today we are here to hear a little bit from Shelley Carson. She is a lecturer and a researcher, and she's splitting her time currently at the Harvard University Department of Psychology? And also as part of the Department of Defense project, Active Deployment. And that is web-based mental health interventions to service members returning from deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan. So thank you for that. I have friends that are coming back, so and hopefully one piece. She is published in numerous articles in national and international scientific journals, and her books on neuroscience and creativity are published by, or are to be published by John Wiley and Sons, and it's due out next year. Next spring? When can we?
Fall.
Next fall.
There'll be one on aging.
Great, great. And her research is on the interface between psychopathology and creativity, has been presented at national symposia and highlighted in national media, including Discovery Channel, CNN, and NPR. Also in international venues. She has won numerous awards and speaks frequently to both academic and general audiences. And her interest in wisdom and aging brain stems from her neuroscience work on creativity and her desire to enhance vitality, flexibility of the brain throughout the lifespan. So we thank you for that as well. So without further ado, Dr. Carson. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And I'd like to thank the Coalition for Life Sciences for inviting me to talk on this not only important, but what I think is a crucial topic for the United States as a society, for those of you who are associated with the oldest seated Congress in the history of the United States, and also for each of us as individuals as we march toward the golden years. And for those of you who think you're not marching there yet, I'd like to just remind you of a study that came out last spring by Timothy Salthouse at the University of Virginia that said cognitive decline begins in the mid-20s. So if you're over 27, you're on the way down, baby. By 2050, according to the U.S. Census of 1990, we will have almost 1 million centenarians. 1 million people, close to 1 million people, who are over the age of 100. Whoever's president of the United States in the year 2050, and it could be one of you all, so you might want to consider how many birthday cards you'll have to sign in the year 2050 as president. Also by the year 2050, the census suggests that we will have nearly twice as many people over the age of 85 as we have under the age of 15. This is sort of a perfect storm confluence between the aging of the baby boomers, the decline in the birth rate, and the ability of medical science to keep our bodies going. The aging population is going to have several consequences for us. We can view the aging population as a benefit or as a curse, depending on whether or not we view our elderly individuals and whether they view themselves as either a font of wisdom, a repository to be referred to by younger generations, or as an economic and social burden. We need to decide whether we're going to honor and respect our elders in the future, or as we attempt to deal with the rapid changing 21st century pace are we going to continue to give more power to youth and to view the aging people as the aging problem? In past societies, and in some places in the world in current societies, elders are revered and respected and have power. They used to be the method of transmission of knowledge and wisdom. However, today, most of our wisdom and knowledge is transmitted through either the internet or through cable news. In fact, studies indicate that we value knowledge more than we value wisdom. So only time will tell whether that's a mistake on our part. One of the questions we have to answer before we can decide how we're going to view the aging population is whether aging, in fact, does bring wisdom. Well, I can tell you that there are no studies that indicate aging alone brings wisdom. In fact, I can think of a number of cases of aged people who were not wise at all. Leona Helmsley comes to mind. Even creative luminaries such as Howard Hughes. When we think about Howard Hughes at the end of his life, he was not a wise man. He was locked in a hotel room, afraid even to let his aides open the windows so that he could have sunlight. So I'd like to kind of change this question a little bit to, can aging bring wisdom? Because clearly we need more than age to be wise. We need to have a combination of mental health, open-mindedness, and a little bit of good luck. But let's assume aging can bring wisdom. If that's the case, then how can we as a society take advantage of that wisdom? So what I'd like to do today is talk about the older and the wiser brain. First of all, we'll define what we mean by aging and what we mean by wisdom. Then we'll look at the older brain, including changes in brain structure and brain function and the deficits in cognition that result from that. We'll also look at the wiser brain, other changes in cognition that may actually benefit wisdom. We'll talk a little bit about how we can enhance the older and wiser brain, and I'll conclude by making a few comments about how we might want to change the way we think about wisdom. Okay, so let's define aging and wisdom. When we look at neuroscience studies of the aging brain, we often see that they divide population into the 60 plus or 65 plus and compare it to the younger brains below the age of 60 or 65. Occasionally, studies will look at 85 plus, what we call super seniors, and compare them either to the 60 to 85 year range or to younger brains. I feel very comfortable in lumping all of them together because, as Salthouse pointed out, and as many of the studies that I've reviewed look at, also point out, basically by the age of 60, the cognitive and brain changes that you're going to see later on are already beginning to be in place. Now, as you might imagine, when you ask psychologists to define something like wisdom, it's not as simple as defining aging. This is a psychological definition of wisdom, but rather than go through this whole thing, we'll narrow it down a little bit. This is from Ursula Staudinger at the Max Planck Institute. After studying wisdom for a number of years, she and her colleagues have decided that wisdom includes a body of knowledge and life experience, the ability to understand what's important in life, the ability to cope with problems, and also to accept uncertainty, and finally, a willingness to share that knowledge with others. So I think you'll agree this is a pretty good definition of what wisdom is. So let's look at the older brain now. The first noticeable change that's associated with aging is a decline in total brain weight and volume. So what we see is a change of somewhere between 5 and 10% of brain volume between the ages of 20 and 90. Most of this volume change occurs in the prefrontal lobes, which, as probably most of you know, is the area of the brain that is the executive. The executive functions include things like planning for the future, complex problem solving, and abstract reasoning. Also in the temporal lobe, in this part of the brain, which is the seat of memory and memory-associated processes. So we begin to see a decline in total brain weight. Part of that is expressed as what's called gyral atrophy. On the left, you have an aging brain, and on the right, you have a control or younger brain. A couple of things I'd like you to notice is that the bulges in the brain, which are called gyri, or a gyrus, and the little wrinkles in the brain, which are called sulci, or wrinkles, that gives additional area for the neurons which make up gray matter. And this, you can see that gray matter is actually gray. And it's a little layer on the edge of the cortex that's about as thick as 3 dimes on top of each other. So that'll kind of give you an idea of how thick that brain is. By the way, your brain weighs about 3 pounds. Male brains are a little heavier than female brains. They're not more intelligent, however. Okay, so then the white matter here is actually the wires that connect the neurons to each other. We'll be looking at those again in a minute. As you can see, there is some gyral atrophy between the young brain and the old brain, such that the bulges on the cortex get smaller and the wrinkles get bigger. Also, you'll see that, that the spaces in between brain matter also increase with size as the brain volume deteriorates. There's also a pattern of cortical thinning that occurs. Now, the cortical thinning includes that really narrow band that we looked at of gray matter. Salat and Randy Buckner, who is now a colleague of mine at Harvard, have looked at a number of brains and noted the cortical thinning patterns. This is an 18-year-old female. This is an 88-year-old female. And as you can see, the darker the coloring gets on those images, the thinner the cortex is becoming. Okay, so we see there's actually selective cortical thinning in several areas that are important. The first area is the sensory motor strip in the brain. This may have something to do with the fact that our motor speed slows down and that our sensory processing becomes a little poorer as we age. We also see that there's selective cortical thinning in the prefrontal cortex. Again, this is the executive part of the brain that controls abstract reasoning and higher level mental processes. And then finally, we see there is also some cortical thinning in the occipital cortex, and that's the part of the brain that processes vision. So as our vision decreases with age, we see cortical thinning in this part of the brain. One of the very important things that happens to our brain as we age is called damaged myelin. This is a graphic of a single neuron in the brain. You have about 10 billion neurons in your brain when you start life, each of them capable of making about 10,000 to 100,000 connections with other neurons. The way it does that is this is the cell body. This is the part that makes up the gray matter of the brain. This is an axon, which is actually the transmitting wire of the neuron. And these dendrites are what connects it to other neurons in the brain. Well, it isn't actually connected. There's a little space called the synapse between the dendrite and, between the axon and one of the dendrites of the receiving neuron. Now, The axon is coated with a fatty substance called myelin. And it actually wraps around the axon like this, and it acts as conducting material. So that a myelinated axon is actually 10 times faster in communicating an electrical signal than a non-myelinated axon. Myelination starts early in life and continues up until the 50s, up until you're around age 50. Then it gradually starts to break down. And what happens is, just like if you mess with the insulation on an electrical wire, you decrease conductivity, you lose speed of conductivity, and also strength of conductivity. And that's what happens as our myelin sheaths start to deteriorate. This can be caused by free radicals in the brain and associated other processes. There's also a decrease in the transmission of the neurotransmitter dopamine. So you may have heard of dopamine in association with the reward system in the brain. It's very important for rewards. It's also been implicated in addiction. There's several different dopamine projections in the brain. The first one that I'm showing you here goes from the brain stem to the striatum, and this is the one where if you have a decrease in dopamine in this area, you have Parkinson-like symptoms. And indeed, we do see that there's an increase in the potential for Parkinson's disease in the elderly. The second one, which is called the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, is implicated in schizophrenia. So if you have too much dopamine in this area of the brain, you may end up with psychotic symptoms. So the good news about losing dopamine is that after about the 6th decade of life, if you're a schizophrenic, you may see your psychotic symptoms reduced. The final dopamine projection that we want to talk about, and which is probably most important to us today, is the mesocortical dopamine pathway. And this innervates all of the prefrontal cortex, that area of the brain that's so important in our higher cognitive functioning. And as that deteriorates, we start seeing decreased ability to activate that part of the brain, and also decreased ability to focus our attention. So those are some of the actual things that are occurring in the brain. How does this manifest itself in cognition? Well, we see deficits in what we call fluid intelligence. Researchers talk about intelligence as having two parts. One is fluid intelligence, which is associated with our working memory. And that's our ability to solve problems using whatever resources we can garner from our brain. The other type of intelligence is called crystallized intelligence, and that's just basically our repository of knowledge. What we see is there's a deficit in fluid intelligence as we age. There are also deficits in episodic memory, which is our ability to remember events that have occurred to us or the things that we have learned at specific times in our life. Also, a slight decrease in motor memory, which is our ability to move our muscles in certain remembered patterns. We also enjoy greater distractibility, which again means it's a little bit more difficult for us to concentrate and focus. And slower speed of mental processing, and this is really important. Okay, so I have a little test for you. I know they probably didn't tell you were going to have to do math here, but here it is. And the reason I want you to see this is if you try to do this problem in your brain, you have to hold several different parts of the solution in your working memory. Now, seniors may be very able to hold each individual part of solving this solution in their brain, but the problem is that if the speed of transmission is slow and working memory has a limited time frame that you can keep all of these different things online in the brain, things start dropping off so that by the time you get to the end of the problem, you may have forgotten what you decided the solution was to the first part of the problem. So you can understand we can come back to that, by the way, if anybody's interested. You can understand how a decline in the speed of processing can interfere with your ability to solve a complex problem and also lead to confusion. What about characteristics of cognition that are associated with wisdom that come with age? Well, we talked about the two types of intelligence, fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence, again, is the body of learning that's stored in your brain. Now, you may have a little bit more difficulty getting to some of that information because speed of processing is slowed down, but you do have a larger body of crystallized intelligence as you age, and that stays relatively intact. We also see that the elderly have cognitive compensation strategies in the brain, and these are really interesting. We can see them in fMRIs and brain imaging. One of the things they do is hyperactivate the prefrontal lobes. So there's a shift in processing from activation of the rear of the brain toward activation of the front part of the brain. It seems that as we lose myelin and as we lose dopamine receptors in the brain, that our brains just have to work harder. And as it turns out, the brains of seniors do work harder. Perhaps that's part of the reason that they feel exhausted after doing mental work. Another compensation that happens is they recruit the right hemisphere or the non-dominant hemisphere of the brain. So as you lose the ability to process with your dominant hemisphere, which for most of us is our left hemisphere, you can recruit neurons from that other side of the brain that hasn't been doing such work as, for instance, language processing. You can use them and, hey, call them over, use them to your advantage. And that is, in fact, what we see in the brains of seniors and super seniors, that they're using both sides of their brain more equally. There's also a preserved ability to learn. So there's some new information that indicates, well, we used to think that you were born with your 10 billion neurons, men got a few more, but that was it, and as they started dying off, that was the end. But there's been new information that suggests we have a continued ability to generate neurons and connections between neurons. And the way we do that is to continue to learn. There's also new information that seniors have decreased reactivity to negative stimuli. That means when they're shown pictures of angry faces and sad faces and fearful faces, when they're in a brain imaging machine, they have less activation of the amygdala, which is associated with processing fear and anger. They have greater activation of a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in emotion regulation. So it seems that seniors are actually better able to modulate their emotions and filter out some of the negativity that's associated with fear and anger. Now, I said that they are also more distractible. How can that be a good thing? I don't think I mentioned this before, but seniors also are subject to more cognitive disinhibition. That means that they're more likely to say what's on their mind and not suppress it, right? Okay, so how can these two things actually improve your wisdom? Well, remember back earlier when we were talking about what are the qualities of wisdom? A body of knowledge and life experience was one component, and we know that you get that with age. The willingness to share that accumulated information with others is another component. Creativity or creative endeavors over centuries has been shown to be one way, the way, that we communicate wisdom to other people. It's often transmitted culturally in the form of poetry, art, music, even gardening. There are a number of different ways that we can transmit knowledge and wisdom through creative endeavors. And as it turns out, and this is some work that's actually been done in our lab, distractibility and cognitive disinhibition both enhance creativity. When you combine crystallized intelligence, fluid intelligence, disinhibition, and distractibility, you enhance creative achievement. We also noticed that creative cognition involves greater recruitment of the right hemisphere. I'm sure a lot of you have heard, oh, the right hemisphere is the creative hemisphere. And creativity also involves inhibition of the fear circuit, which we saw seniors were more able to do with their emotional modulation. So as far as cognition goes, seniors are in a good place to be creative. What about slower processing speed? Well, a lot of research indicates that the speed of processing when you're doing creative endeavors is only important in math and theoretical physics. If you're an artist, if you're a composer, if you're a fiction writer, you don't need to worry about that cognitive speed as much. The elderly also have other characteristics that would lend them to being wise and creative, including additional leisure time, fewer responsibilities, and greater self-knowledge. So we see that there are a number of people who are starting their creative careers in their 90s, including Millard Kaufman, Lorna Page, who wrote, I guess a novel that the Catholic Church would ban. We see people like Grandma Moses. So a number of people begin their creative careers at a later and later age, and that's a good thing. This is some work that we've done in our lab that indicates highest age of creative productivity. What you'll see here is this red line is poets. Well, they don't fare so well. They don't produce poetry for the most part. Obviously, we can think of some exceptions, such as Robert Frost. But part of the reason that they don't produce creativity into late life is they have a tendency to die early. Okay, so if you're already 90, it's okay to start writing poetry because you don't need to worry about dying early. Scientists, we see, also lose productivity as they age, for the most part. That does not include medical research. That can continue well into late life. What we see is composers, artists, and writers can all be highly productive late in life. And that's really a good thing. Many of you may be familiar with Gene Cohen's study on creativity and aging. This was a federally funded study in which he found that seniors that engage in creative writing, poetry, or painting have better physical, mental health, take fewer medications, and they are more independent. So engaging in creative expression of wisdom is a good thing for our seniors. Here are some other ways that we've found that you can enhance the aging brain. And these are very important. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will go through a couple. The most important is physical exercise. Physical exercise, through a variety of studies, has been shown to increase oxygen flow to the brain, decrease free radicals that I said were involved in demyelinization of the brain, also increase prefrontal lobe functioning by actually enhancing the availability of dopamine in the prefrontal lobes. You'll see also that physical exercise can cut the risk for dementia in half. Here's a study by Colcom and Kramer. The areas of the brain that are most subject to decline, to cognitive decline, were greatly increased through a program of exercise, including even processing speed, which we said was a big problem, and those executive functions that we also said were a problem. Now, Britain has taken these studies seriously, and they have started to make playgrounds for the elderly. And these playgrounds have special equipment on them to protect the bones of seniors, which will often be more fragile, but also to get them the aerobic exercise they need. And aerobic exercise is the key here. Mental exercise is also important. It's very important to continue to learn. Remember, I told you that we have evidence that learning helps you to build new neurons in the brain. A study done by Sarah Lazar right at Harvard indicates that meditation can also improve cognitive functioning in the elderly. Forced mental engagement means that you don't allow yourself to drift into that kind of daydreaming state that often we see seniors spend a lot of time in. You have to force yourself to focus and mentally engage. And by doing that, you actually increase your cognitive functioning. And finally, a new study has indicated that a training program based on a memory task called the NBAC memory task actually increases fluid intelligence. So virtually all the things that looked like they were in decline in aging can be at least stopped, possibly reversed. Diet is another important aspect of this. I am so sorry to hear that reduced calorie intake is associated with improved memory. Well, it is. I'll make this list available to anybody that wants it. These are foods that have been shown through scientific studies to improve mental functioning. Some very interesting things there. This I would consider to be one of the most important, omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids actually change an intracellular component of the firing of neurons. This is also very important for mood regulation. So any of you who are at risk for bipolar disorder should be taking omega-3 fatty acids. It's good for mood regulation and cognitive performance. Sociality is another really important aspect of enhancing cognitive functioning. So there have been a number of studies that show that spending time with other people in social situations, spending time with loved ones, dating, etc., increases short-term memory functioning and decreases the risk for dementia. Now, one of the other things I might point out is that there's one of the reasons that seniors stop socializing and live isolated lives is because their sensory organs are decreasing in function. They don't see as well, and especially they don't hear as well. They misunderstand, and they're frankly embarrassed. So I also think it's really important that we make sure our seniors have sensory augmentation when necessary, in the form of better hearing aids and in the form of vision correction, so that they can get out there and socialize, because that's very important. It's also a reason that they quit interacting with their environment in other ways. They may quit learning, they may not take a class because they're embarrassed because they can't see or hear. So sensory augmentation is also very important. I'd like to conclude with a few comments about changing the way we think about wisdom. I think it's important that we rethink the concept of retirement. If we're going to have 1 million people in our country over the age of 100 by the year 2050, they are going to have a very long lifespan between mandatory retirement at 65 and the end of their life. They need to be directed not perhaps into other kinds of paid work, but into other kinds of occupations or activities that will keep them mentally active. We need to educate our future seniors on their cultural role. So if we enhance the expectation of seniors that they will continue to produce, that they will continue to share their wisdom with younger generations, we will be doing them a favor. I also think we need to market the concept of wisdom to youth. As I say, the younger generations are more interested in knowledge than they are in wisdom. And that's very understandable given the rapid pace of change in this country in virtually all areas. I myself am extremely excited about all of the technological changes that are going on, especially in my field, but I don't want to give up the wisdom that we can learn from our older people. We've successfully marketed attitudes before. Right now in my work, I notice that we are successfully marketing a destigmatization of mental illness within the military. And this is really important because prior really to the Iraqi war, people in the military were afraid to seek help when they were having mental disorder symptoms because of the stigma. We are reversing that. I don't mean just me, but we as a society are reversing that, and it is becoming more and more acceptable for these people to seek and receive the kinds of help they need for post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other associated mental problems that come from serving our country. So I think we can do that same kind of marketing to market the concept of wisdom as being important. Finally, I think we also need to stress individual responsibility for brain care and continued exploration in the senior cohort. It seems to me that with Social Security system, with forced retirement from corporations and CEOs and corporations becoming ever younger, that we are almost promoting planned obsolescence for our older people. I'd like to leave you with one thought. Think about this. Think about one bit of wisdom that you've accrued over the years, something that you think young people might not know, but it would be important for them to know. Now imagine some novel and original way of embedding that bit of wisdom that you have into the culture. It may be necessary for you to learn a brand new domain. You may have to learn how to paint. You may have to learn how to play the piano. You may have to learn how to program a computer. But imagine if we could get every senior, every healthy senior, to find that one bit of wisdom that they have, to put it into a cultural domain. Imagine how we would increase, even multiply, our cultural wealth. I think we should do this. Thank you.
Time for question and answers if anyone has any questions for Dr. Carson.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that most people are left brain, and that
Yes.
you tend to, as you start losing your left brain, you sort of
Can compensate with
the right
recruiting the right brain.
For people who are right brain, do they
Yes.
do the same thing, and if so, what?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question. Most people are not right-brained. We associate, because each hemisphere of the brain operates the opposite side of the body, we assume that everybody who's right-handed has the left hemisphere as their dominant hemisphere. But it isn't the case that left-handers have the right hemisphere as their dominant hemisphere. They're simply less lateralized than right-handed people. So left-handed people show more communication between the two hemispheres. They're less lateralized to begin with. And most of the research that I've seen done on this particular thing has been limited to right-handed people. So I can't really answer your question, what happens with left-handed people. Yes?
So you mentioned mandatory retirement at 65. In fact, for many individuals, there actually is no mandatory retirement age. That may be an executive type. And so part of that, again, given what the stock market has done recently, anticipating that there might be more and more seniors that continue to be in the marketplace, is there any policy being developed in terms of taking advantage or helping or somehow working with a group of individuals that basically are going to be say, between 60 and 80 before perhaps dropping out of the marketplace?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I really think this age between 60 or 65 and 85 is a very, very productive age period. You may want to be transitioning power in organizations to younger people during that time. And in fact, we certainly have a trend of doing that. But there certainly should be a consulting role for those people between the ages 60 and 85. Now, I know that New York City has a wonderful teaching program where they recruit people between the ages of 65 and 85 to come into the public school system and teach all different kinds of things. So that's a wonderful idea. I don't know of others, but I think that with the aging of our population, we should certainly be coming up with ways that we can utilize, especially that 65 to 85-year-old group, and get from them what they have to offer us. If you have any suggestions, write them to me. Here's my address.
No tenure.
Yes.
About the only things that taste good to seniors are sweet and salty, and those things aren't particularly good. How should seniors cope with that?
Because they're not particularly good for you, is what you mean. Well, as in your overall reduction of caloric intake, which you need to do, you need to focus on your whole grains, your fruits, your vegetables, and your lean meats. I don't know what to tell you, except I personally use a lot of Tabasco sauce. And I found that just about everything tastes good when I do that. Any other questions? Yes.
The slide about myelin, I looked at the bottom, and the website it was from started out me vitamin. Is there some sort of indication that a certain vitamin? I mean,
Okay, so if we go back to let me go back to this because I think a lot of people are, by the way, I didn't show, we are experimenting with steroid drugs that do seem to be increasing activation and enhancement in the prefrontal lobes. Let's go back to this. Okay, so given modern research, especially by this group, a number of vitamins seem to be beneficial to cognitive functioning. Again, if you want to email me, I can send you that slide. Yes?
How do you feel about supplementing with phosphatidylserine, L-methylfolate, dopamine?
Some of the dopamine precursors seem to be beneficial. One of the problems that we have with this, though, is the drugs that tend to increase dopamine production in the prefrontal lobes also increase heart rate and blood pressure. So this can be dangerous for seniors who don't have good cardiovascular health. This definitely needs to be, approved by your physician. But I think that another thing that I think is really interesting is you would think, since the part of the brain that's losing dopamine is the same part of the brain that we see has subpar dopamine in people with ADHD or attention deficit disorder. So you would think that maybe Ritalin or one of the treatments for ADHD would be beneficial for this. They haven't been shown to be. They may improve speed of processing a little bit, but they aren't really improving cognition. So I can't quite understand why that's the case. Yes?
One more question. I'd like to know the answer to the quiz that you gave us.
Oh, okay. Okay, shall I go back? Did you have another question? Then we'll go back to the quiz. Oh, you've got the answer. Okay. All right, let's see if we can get back to that. Oh, wrong way. By the way, that's an NBAC test that I've got that you just saw. We can try that too. It's very difficult. Oop. See, my processing speed is slow. I couldn't stop myself in time. Okay. All right. Who wants to give? Do you want to hear the answer, or do you want more time to look at it, Lynn? Okay. Would you like to tell us the answer?
I think it's 121.
Okay, what is A, B, or C? What is A?
A is 9, B is 2.
C is 1. Okay, that is the correct answer. Now, would you like to just give one hint as to how you figured that out? What was the first thing you figured?
Well, I figured that the C had to be a 1.
And the reason?
I don't know.
Okay, the reason is that when you're going to carry a number over, which is happening here, you can't carry more than 1.
Right.
Okay? All right, so automatically you know C is 1, and then you have to work from there. But the whole point is that you have to hold a number of elements of this problem in mind in order to solve it. And if you're slow, you might be able to solve each individual piece of it, but by the time you get to the letter A, what was C again? So this can be a problem, and it becomes very confusing for seniors because of the slow processing speed. Any other comments or questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.